This video accompanies the Sound on Sound Session Notes series of articles on the production of the Damnation's Hammer album, Unseen Planets, Deadly Spheres. I'm just going to talk you through some of the challenges I faced at the mix stage and some of the processing approaches I used. Starting with the rhythm guitars, you can see here the attenuation notch at 131 Hz, which helped contain the most obvious resonance during the palm muted sections, where problematic chug thump, this sort of resonant droning quality, becomes evident. So it's like an overly dynamic frequency specific problem, but also one that is time variable, kind of like sibilance. So if I had have applied deeper corrective EQ to address this resonance, the low frequencies of the sound during the non-palm muted sections would have become a little bit thin. So I used dynamic EQ to get round this, using the Brainworks BX Dyne EQ V2. I dialed in a near zero attack time here, centered at 131 Hz, so that it's delivering increased attenuation in line with increased chug thump in the input signal. Moving on to the bass. As you've probably read, Jamie is a fingers rather than pick player who has a really powerful percussive performance style. So I had to be really careful that I needed to prevent the percussive note attack, the sort of high frequency clank, from overshadowing the note attack of the guitars or appearing sort of disconnected from the kick drums. So I adopted this frequency bracketing approach, which provided me with a lot of control over the bass sound. This is a technique that Jens Bogram, his actual approach I adopted, I found it really quite powerful and really effective. So I had a bass DI and a bass amp cab signal. However, after duplicating the DI track twice, one of which to be processed for a dedicated channel of distortion, I had 4 bass channels to sculpt and blend. So by assigning the tight controlled qualities of the DI to the low end, as you can see here, a high pass filter at 100 Hz and a low pass filter at 260, and then the comparatively more lumpy amp cab signal delivering the mids to highs. As you can see here, a high pass filter at 260 and a low pass filter at 960, that provided the mids of the sound. And then from here, I reintroduced the DI into the high end of the sound between 950 and 4.5, delivering a sort of clear, wiry note definition, and then the dedicated channel distortion supplied by the Ampeg SVT Pro plugin was then frequency bracketed to the upper mids, sort of keeping everything between 600 and 900 on the unit's graphic, and this attenuated the distorted signals, muddy lows and abrasive highs. So as the DI track assigned to the lows no longer contained any mid to high frequency attack attributes, I was able to radically compress this signal using a fast attack time from the 1176 LN, which with a broadband signal would have sort of flattened and dulled down the signal. So this really gave me a stable low end to the bass sound. But conversely, the compression applied to the mids bracketed amp cab track featured a medium attack setting and less gain reduction, thereby retaining the signal's transient detail. And a further benefit of this approach was that I had direct control over the top end finger attack from the performance via the duplicated DI signal. I could control not only its mix level, but I directly manage its dynamic content. And so with quite a high ratio, but also a high threshold, the compression was mainly hitting the signal peaks and really, containing that clank. I was using a fairly fast 3 milliseconds attack time and a medium release time, and this provided quite effective smoothing out of the signal. Moving on to the parallel snare distortion treatment. As mentioned, I took aux feeds from the top and snare bottom channels, but predominantly the snare top, and routed them to the UAD Vertigo VSM3, which is an analog style saturation coloration unit by Brainworks. I experimented with the second harmonic FET crusher and the third harmonic Zener blender, which provide really powerful flexible control over the distortion produced. And I was able to generate that high frequency attack and generate that content that was slightly missing, that I couldn't get because of I couldn't dial in the highs because of the amount of hat spill that was going on there. So this proved really effective at getting quite an aggressive, punchier, fuller snare sound that was holding its own when placed within the bass and the guitars. Last but certainly not least came vocal effects, which we didn't really track up many of the vocal. It's just a mono vocal. So the central requirement here was that I got a wider, less monophonic image to the vocals. So as a starting point, similar to the drums, I set up two different reverb return paths. I used the UAD RMX16 using its plate program with just a fairly short 1.2 second decay and a 0 pre-delay on this. And the second almost contrary approach was a sort of a slapback reverb. So it was a 1.2 room reverb from the Relab LX480, but with pre-delay dialed in with an eighth note millisecond value, in this instance 159 milliseconds, and so it keeps it up front but separates the reverb. The first reverb's effective for submerging the vocal into the mix, but too much level would reduce the intelligibility of the vocal, whereas the slapback reverb delivered depth and dimension, but was at the same time effective for keeping the vocal closer to the listener. So I actually reduced the low frequencies of both on the return path and experimented with the most effective contribution from each. Let's move on to the delay lines. First thing that I did is used a slap delay. I think this was about 160 milliseconds. And this, again, it was this idea of giving just more depth and space to the vocal, all these different delay lines. So the first slapback delay, I put a Studio A800 in a post-delay insert slot to help gel the effect into the mix. Then I turned to multi-tap delay lines with the return pass pan fully wide, the first of which involved a quarter note on each side, but with one raised by 5 milliseconds and the second lowered by 5 milliseconds. And with moderate feedback settings, this provided a musically appropriate repeat, but with the differences between the left and right, there was a little subtle widening of the vocal sound. And from here I set up a very long delay lines featuring a half note on the right and slightly longer half note dotted on the left, both with strong feedback settings. Again, low pass filters were used to sort of forcibly gel the delay into the mix. But I also applied a fairly healthy dose of Sound Toys Decapitator using the Punish setting. Lastly, on the vocal effects widening front, I applied pitch thickening width enhancement. So this involves routing two separate mono aux sends from the vocal to two separate mono aux tracks with mono delay plugins inserted on each, pan fully wide in opposite directions. The delays were dialed in to be 8 milliseconds apart, but with 0 feedback, and with the midway point between these values being 20 milliseconds, which is the sort of ADT automatic double tracking echo region. So the first delay was set to 16 milliseconds and the second to 24 milliseconds. Then I inserted a post-delay pitch shifter on each return, with one sharpening the delay by 8 cents, the other detuning the delay by 8 cents, which provided a thicker vocal sound and a wider vocal image. All right, let's have a quick listen to the final mixed and mastered production.
Black
Thanks for watching Sound on Sound readers. I hope you found this useful.